Latin America is a relatively young region, but it won't be for much longer. An aging population creates a number of challenges for the governments of the region, which are responsible for providing high-quality social protection to their residents, and for doing so in a fiscally sustainable way. What is the impact of an aging population on pension and healthcare systems, especially for the most vulnerable groups? How does informal labor affect these systems? What are the effects of technological changes on jobs and protection of the elderly? CAF, Development Bank of Latin America, presents the 2020 Economy and Development Report, EDR, Social Protection for the Elderly, Present and Future Challenges in Latin America, a key document to learn how to address the challenges in the design of pension and healthcare systems in the region, and work towards universal and high-quality social protection for the elderly. Downloaded at www.cioteca.caf.com.
Good morning. My name is Dulce Vasquez. On behalf of CAF, Development Bank of Latin America, I want to welcome you to the presentation of the RED 2020, Pension and Health Systems in Latin America, the Challenges of Aging, Technological Change and Informality. This report by CAF covers the different challenges of civil systems, and it offers some recommendations to build better systems for senior citizens. This document is available on www.caf.com, the complete version and the executive summary. We have a number of lecturers that will talk about aging, technological changes, and informality, elements that affect the sustainability of social systems in Latin America. Please share your opinions using the Agenda CAF and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. This event is being broadcast in English, Portuguese, and in Spanish at caf.com, on YouTube and LinkedIn and Facebook. Now we'll have Luis Carranza Ugarte, Executive President of CAF. Gabriel Giorgio, Undersecretary of Public Credit of the Ministry of Finance, members of the panel. My dear friends, for me it is a great pleasure to welcome you to the presentation of the RED 2020. We have to do this online because of the pandemics, a pandemic that has affected Latin America in a significant way because of the structural deficiencies that we have in our region. For instance, the low coverage of social protection. Our countries invest resources towards the protection of vulnerable parts of the society, especially in health and pensions. We have a number of risks in the future. Number one, the demographics show an aging process of the population. Demographics are still positive in Latin America, but this is changing in some countries. In fact, we are finishing with this upward trend. We also have high informality in labor markets. So the participation of workers in pension systems is rather low. This actually imposes a tax pressure on the system. So what are these impacts? We need to have an agenda in order to face these challenges in labor markets. And finally, the productivity agenda is a must amidst technological change. the technological transformation of our society represents opportunities and challenges. That's why we have invited a number of panelists that will help us think about the best public policies for our civil protection systems in Latin America. So I want to thank you for your participation. Thank you, President Carranza. And now we give the floor to the Undersecretary of the Ministry of Finance and Public Credit, Gabriel Jorio Gonzalez. Good morning. I want to thank Luis Carranza and CAF for the invitation to participate in the presentation of this very important report, the RED 2020, that this year focuses on important challenges in the region. I only want to say something. Latin America has made progress over the last 5 years. This type of dialogues promoted by agencies such as CAF are very important in order to understand the challenges that we are going to be facing in the future as a region. In Latin America, we have discussed subjects about strengthening governance and modernization of infrastructure, but the region has got inequality challenges. We need to talk about pension and health systems, so they are aligned to new challenges. This is something very important. And this is the purpose of the panels that we are going to have today. As Luis Carranza was mentioning, it was high time to have this type of discussion, especially in view of the COVID-19, because COVID-19 is really changing technology, and we have to face the fact that we have an aging population. We have challenges in terms of gender. The Latin American region has areas of opportunity, very important areas of opportunity when it comes to the participation of women in the labor market and the salary that women receive. In this type of events, we need to talk about public policies, and we have to ask ourselves how to finance these. In Mexico, we have a reform of the pension system, but we have to think about how to do it, and we have to do it step by step. I only want to wish you a wonderful day. I am sure that you will have a great discussion because of the quality of the members of the different panels. So may you have a follow us at Agenda CAF on Twitter and Facebook. And now we're going to start with a report presentation. Pension and health care systems in Latin America, challenges of an aging population, technological change, and informal economy. So I give the floor to Fernando Alvarez. He's the senior economist at CAF and co-editor of the RED 2020, and he will be presenting this report. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the regional presentation of the RED 2020. This year's subject is very important from a structural point of view. We need to take into consideration healthcare in households. However, the report comes at the right time because of the situation that we are living, as it has been mentioned. I am talking about the COVID emergency and how it has affected the different areas of our lives. It is important to have social healthcare systems for everyone. What really matters is the demographic aspect of the population, the aging of the population. This is the foundation of this year's report. Latin America is a young region. 8 out of 10 people are young people, according to OECD information. But this is going to change over the following 20 years. Senior citizens, the amount of senior citizens will double, and the region will start an aging process with specific characteristics. Number one, the accelerated process. In some of the countries, this has taken over a century. But in Latin America, this will happen in 20 or 23 years, so this is a big challenge. The other element is the general aspect of this phenomenon. There are differences in the region. Obviously, we have different countries like Uruguay with a different situation, but the countries will experience an increase of the senior citizen ratio. So we need to understand how this aging process affects pension and healthcare systems. Aging is something good. Aging is the result of the improved health systems, but it also has an impact. For instance, the number of healthcare cases. And I am having some problems moving through the slides. There is a clear relationship between the senior citizen ratio and the public expense in pensions and healthcare systems. The region spends more than 4 points of the GDP in pensions and healthcare systems. But because of the aging process, this can go up to 3.4 points of the GDP. So it is essential to think about how we can understand these pension systems and how to align them to these dynamics. In this discussion, it is important to have a clear idea of something that is natural, that sometimes it's neglected. How the social elements have an impact on the budget and how this link represents challenges. From the point of view of systems, we have to talk about the coverage and the expense per patient. Talking about incomes, we have to talk about the ratio of holders and how much they participate and how much they participate in the process. What is a good social protection system? It is a system that offers a broad coverage that has a big variety of services and that is sustainable financially. Obviously, the state has got different functions, so the budget is rather limited. And we have some questions. If we want to increase coverage, well, many countries want to do this, but this is going to have implications. And the same goes if we want to increase the expenses per patient, per beneficiaries. And this is what we need in order to close the existing gaps. If we don't do anything, then we are going to compromise the sustainability of the system. So we have rather high deficits in the systems, and these deficits will get bigger because of the aging process. How can we reduce these deficits? How can we minimize the impact on the expense or the ratio? Each of the countries in the region has got different challenges depending on their reality. There is an important element highlighted by the report. There are some environmental elements that condition these challenges, and they condition social protection in general. We have already mentioned the aging process. There are some other elements pertaining the labor market, the informality and technological change. So, the idea is to study current challenges faced by our pension and health systems from the point of view of informality, technological change, and the aging population in order to develop something to improve our systems. Now I am going to talk about the labor context in order to talk about the pension and health care systems and how to finance these challenges. Today's presentation is only the tip of the iceberg. Please download the RED report from our website. Let's start with informality. Informality, or the informal economy, is something that is repeated in Latin America. Poorer countries have higher levels of informal economy, and we can see this on the chart. But countries in the region normally have an excessive informality. We have the blue dots representing the Latin American countries, and as you can see, those points are above the average. And I am sure the COVID situation is going to worsen the situation. People are losing jobs. If they don't get a formal job, then this might increase the informality levels. What are the problems? What is the impact of informality on the labor market? Well, we have less participation of taxpayers when it comes to the dependents. Let me give you an example of informality. The informality in the region reduces the amount of tax holders that is equal to 40 years into the future. And it also makes it difficult to design social protection programs. We have proof that this can affect the incentives for the creation of formal positions, and this has to be taken into consideration when developing schemes. And lastly, informality also reduces access to tax systems. In order to elaborate on this, in the report, we analyze information, administrative records from the social security sector, and we can see the different trends of workers. Next slide. Well, in the meantime, we have 4 countries in the study: Ecuador, Uruguay, Brazil, and Argentina. We studied the labor history of workers, and we tried to analyze how much workers participate in the social system. Here we have the charts for each of these countries. The general idea is that many workers participate in the system for a short time. Ecuador, 34%, that is the amount of workers that participate in the system, and they only participate 1/4 of the labor life. And this information is quite similar for the cases of Uruguay and Brazil. We have some differences in the case of Argentina, but this is not because of the labor market in Argentina, but because of the data from Argentina. We only have income and outcome. And this really shows, this moves the information towards the left. If we were to present the information from the other countries in this same pattern, we would have similar results. So we can say that all 4 countries have a similar situation. So these change between formality and informality compromises access to services in the future and access to healthcare systems in the present. In the report, we analyze what percentage of workers can have 30 years of participation in the system, but it all depends on the country. Talking about technological change, the first risk that is mentioned is about the potential loss of opportunities, especially for workers that do repetitive work that can be taken by machines. This is an automation process, but it hasn't started in the region. But it is going to happen, and we need to understand what percentage of workers have these vulnerabilities. These are the main cities of the region, and we can see that 40% of our positions are vulnerable because these are repetitive activities that can be automated. We are talking about low education workers. So we're going to have automation. We have to have policies in order to bring workers back to the formal market. Now, talking about the technological change, we have to talk about platform works. The relationship between the customer and the company takes place on a platform. For instance, Uber. We can see some trends using the CAF survey. More than 50% of workers can be classified as platform workers, and 9% already have worked on platforms. 41% of these workers say that this is their main source of income. So this is important information. We also analyzed the possibility of participating in the system in comparison with other workers. In the case of self-employment, there is a higher probability of participating in the social security system. So this can be understood as an opportunity to attract self-employers or employees in the region that normally do not participate in the system. So let's talk about the pension systems. Let's talk about coverage, amount, and financial sufficiency. In terms of coverage, we can be positive or negative. Over the last 20 years, the region has grown in terms of coverage by 20%, and this has been and this can be explained by the evolution of the systems. But we can also be negative because not many countries have a wide coverage. Many countries only have a universal coverage. There are some countries, such as Peru or Bolivia, that have a coverage below 50%. And this is because the workers are not really participating in the social security system because of the labor dynamics. And self-employees, sometimes they do not participate because there is no system encouraging them to participate when it comes to the amounts. Well, I am going to talk about contributive and non-contributive pensions. In this case, we are concentrating on inclusion and fight of poverty. So one of the main points to take as a reference is the poverty line. Most countries offer non-contributive pensions, but there are some countries like Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia, and those non-contributive pensions do not even reach the poverty line. Now, talking about the amounts of contributive pensions, salary or the replacement rate is the main source of information. This is what we use in the report for different types of individuals. It is not only to talk about the maximums, it is also to talk about the real levels. And we can see that these systems, like that of Ecuador, have rates that are above of other OECD countries, and some other countries have lower rates. This is something that the OIT promotes as a very low value. And self-employees have a higher rate, a higher replacement rate. Now, talking about the fiscal sustainability, this is something very important because we have a contract whereby the employers participate for a given period of time, then the workers receive a pension fund until they die, or even afterwards. You can see the sustainability of the system by looking at the contributions of workers and how they manage their pension flows once they retire.
What we have here is a ratio between the present value on the one hand and contributions on the other side. If there is 100%, it means that the value of the payments for pensions is higher than the other one. What we see in general is that our systems are unbalanced. Only Brazil has ratings of close to 100%. Other countries like Argentina and Chile have an imbalanced ratio, but countries like Ecuador, where pensions have a cost that is 5 times higher than others. With aging, we expect that the figures will go up, among other things, because workers will be able to contribute like this. What are some of the guidelines that we can think about for pensions? First of all, workers, or we should try to have all workers having access to a minimum sufficient income. And this has an important acceptance in the CAF survey. We explored the level of acceptance and the minimum income regardless of the contributions. And what we have found is that between 68 and 89% of citizens in the region, depending on what we have mentioned, are in agreement or very much in agreement with this. We also explored how much it would cost to expand coverage to make it universal. A non-contributory pension, a typical non-contributory pension. And this would be somewhat reasonable, 0.24% nowadays, considering the demographics today, and 0.66% in the year 2065. Another important guideline is that pensions are financially sustainable. Countries like Ecuador have a lot to do for the replacement rate, but this is related to the minimum retirement age. So according to our calculations, this will lower the percentage points, and many countries have said that there is no convergence in international standards, and this could even change in order to have the right system. Now we are going to look at care. We have looked at coverage, pension amounts, or spending per beneficiary, and other topics related to sustainability. To begin with coverage, we have identified a system, a fragmented system, where there are different types of insurance. On the one hand, it is very little used in the region, especially among higher income people. We have the contributory system for formal health systems, and this in general is found in 56%, but it is much more important in the southern cone countries like Chile and Argentina. Then we have non-contributory health. This is about 40% in the region. It is a lot more important in countries like Bolivia, Peru, Paraguay. And an important characteristic is quality related to the levels of spending per beneficiary. And these are systems which are also found within contributory systems. And this is one of the most important guidelines. With regards to quality of the rendering of services and the level offered by the health system, we believe that an effective coverage, this has also established by the WHO, defines a coverage where everyone will be able to have access on a timely fashion and with a good quality to all health services in order to have a full, healthy life without compromising financially the persons. So we have to consider this dimension of access to health services, which is vital, and the dimension of financial protection and the ratio of households with this spending above the 10% of their income. So the vertical line represents the situation of poor countries. And what have we seen here? First of all Latin American countries have blue dots, and they are under the line. With regards to the coverage index, we are way below the level that we find in more developed countries. But if we look at the other axis, many countries are offering very little financial protection for a small fraction of households. And some cases stand out, like Brazil, Argentina, Dominican Republic. So the big challenge for health systems is apparently to close this coverage gap. How much would it cost to close a coverage gap? At least in terms of access to services? Well, it depends on the quality that we have and our financial resources. But with the levels that we currently have, we would have, in order to close the gap, we would have to use 2.5 percentage points of the GDP. However, and this can be seen in the chart, we find the border, how our Latin American countries, many countries in the region, are under the efficiency line. And this gap could be closed by improving this spending in health. This is an important message It is not only related to spending more, but spending better in terms of health. This is very clear. The guidelines regarding sustainability topics, well, the starting point would involve important deficits in countries like Argentina, 3% of the GDP, but we expect, as is natural, that with aging, these deficits would be close to 4 points of the GDP. Something important that we have not mentioned in detail is related to the fact that there could be some spending demands given the care situation for elderly people. To give you an idea, the most developed countries, 16 out of 31 developed countries, spend more than 1 GDP point in long-term care, and 87% of that would be a different source that would commit or compromise the financial situation or health systems, including the elderly care systems. What are the guidelines in this case? A greater integration of health subsystems, some explicit health plans between the different topics that are presented, the development of a spending control mechanism, and an efficient use of resources. We could think of focused co-payment, improving the payment to suppliers systems, and improving information systems. It could improve or reduce corruption, especially in health procurement processes. It is also important to develop a prevention policy, a pillar in the promotion of healthy lifestyle systems, and also to develop policies of care. To give you an idea of how important this could be, we are giving you some of the data with the requirements in order to take care of elderly adults in the region. For instance, in Ecuador, almost 30% of the elderly aged 75 need some type of care, and 20% of adults between 65 and 74 years of age need some type of care. And these cares are mainly provided by the family informally. Care services are very little developed, both at home as well as institutional. So less than 1% of adults, elder adults, live in adult homes. And this dependency on the family can be compromised as well by the demographic trends, like the reduction in the family size, and also the willingness to participate more in taking care of the needs. This is the greatest participation of women in the labor market, which could affect even more care. Now, in the little time that I have left, let's talk about how to fund these challenges. I started by recommending the initial situation is a deficit situation that will be worsened in 3.7 points of the GDP given the demographic change if no decisions are made, and this implies an important challenge. Besides, like I said earlier, some countries are facing the challenge of aging of the population. They have the challenge of increasing coverage, but I feel that there are still some spaces in order to introduce this. One of the first spaces is to increase the contribution rates. Compared to the average levels of contribution in Latin America, apparently there are not too many spaces, at least for several countries. Some, even when they have averages above, but there is the region is very heterogeneous, and we also have different subsystems. So there are some countries that are indeed having some margin in order to increase those rates. However, it seems to be that there is greater space in the increase of the contributory basis. So there are some potential spaces, potential channels to increase the participation of women on the one hand, and second, to reduce other things in order to see how much gains could be obtained in these two areas. In the report, we have some scenarios, and we are measuring what we call the gender bonus. The gender bonus looks at how much income would go up if we, to each group of women in a certain education and age group, if we make them participate just like their counterpart participates. But we assign the formal and informal sector the rate of informality of that group. And the other exercise is attempting to see what would happen if the region would converge, not in terms of the OECD formality levels, but in accordance to the chart that we have seen earlier. What have we found? That we can collect close to 1% of the GDP, which is explained mainly by what we call the formality bonus. The gender bonus is different because many of the women that are joining do it under informality conditions. The formalization policy has some margin in order to improve these systems, and it goes beyond Social Security. However, it clearly shows the role that it plays, and it is very hard to provide Social Security in developed countries with labor markets and productivity that we have in Latin America. And it shows that productive development and development of labor markets is a clear ally in terms of improving quality of these social protection systems. This does not mean that with our current structures, there is not much to be done in order to improve the quality of these systems. And my time is almost out, and I'd like to close with some final considerations. First of all the countries are facing challenges in terms of the design of elderly protection. They become more complex with the COVID shock, and they thus demand some reforms in one way or another. In order to make these reforms, challenges, very important challenges, are faced in terms of policy, which imply or involve building capacities and a combination of different instruments. Also, the combination of instruments is also considered. And we have to bear in mind that social protection of the elderly is not only the role of the state. It must be considered as a social protection to different age groups that make up our population, different age groups that have protection throughout the life cycle. I'd like to close with this. I'd like to thank you again. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Fernando, for this very interesting presentation and such an important presentation. I'd like to remind you that you can share your opinions in social networks with hashtag RedCAF and follow our account in @AgendaCAF in Facebook and Instagram. Next, we have the pleasure to welcome Ms. Carmen Raquez and Santiago Levy, who will be sharing and be making comments on this report. Carmen, she headed the labor market division at the Inter-American Development Bank until September this year. She used to work as a senior economist on labor matters at the World Bank, and she has a master's degree in economy from the Autonomous University in Barcelona, a PhD from Boston University. Thank you so much, Carmen, for joining us today. Please. Good afternoon. Yes, we hear you, Carmen, please. It is a pleasure for me to see you. Thank you to all the panelists and members of this. I am very pleased to be here, and I'd like to thank you for dealing with this very important topic in your list of reports. The report has shown, and also previous reports by the World Bank, by the IDB, they have placed emphasis on social protection systems in the region. They are facing very serious problems in terms of coverage. In some cases, it is high. In some cases, it is very low. It faces problems regarding sustainability. Some countries face sustainability issues. And I'd like to underscore that this is a problem related to a social protection system that is redistributing, but the other way around. And Santiago Levy, I thank you for joining me in this panel. And we'll be talking about the problems of affecting the good workings of the labor market. So facing these problems is a difficult task. I'd like to ask all the persons who are doing public policies in Latin American governments, social protection systems are at the core of the social compact, and these are very sensitive topics. And in many of the cases, touching upon them or improving them may be perceived as reforms that eliminate rights or that generate poverty, but the trend is to postpone it until the patient is in the intensive care unit, where I have to tell the patient, you have very few options, you're ending. Or when the popular effervescence is so much expressed in public opinion, like in the case of Chile, people are out on the streets, and there are other considerations to bear in mind. By the social protection system was essentially generating social unrest. And now more than ever, I would exhort countries in the region to issue reforms that will enable us to have social protection systems that will help us achieve a broad coverage, hopefully universal. I think that what is most important is to have a universality nature that will provide coverage to persons, to the population at risk, in a sustainable way, not only for today, but also for tomorrow. And I would underscore in an equal fashion, placing special care on social protection systems not becoming a barrier for productivity and the working of the country. This is urgent. Why? Because not having it has generated important social welfare problems, and it places at risk democracies because it lowers their ability to reach the population, and especially under circumstances as difficult as the ones we are experiencing now. So the fragility of the state is clearly shown, and precarious work and productivity go down, and this perpetuates the cycle. And this urgency goes up, and it is shown in the report. This is due to the aging of the population, and if there are any shocks like the one that we are experiencing. Another very powerful reason is that it makes it easier to make adjustments, thinking 30 or 40 years in the future, as opposed to leaving things to the last minute. Like I said earlier on, we have to make the decision to avoid, in the very little time they have, to define what to place in the report. It is always something very complex. There are topics that are competing, but, well, this is part of the report. I'd like to somehow expand to give you my opinion. I'd like to express this message in the report. Some are here, some are not in it. Why 5 and not 3? Give 3 messages. I think that the report is so important that it could have given 5 messages, but I'll try to be quick. The first message is that in order to make reforms to the social protection system, We should not only look within the social protection system. This is very important. Santiago will deal with this in more depth. Systems, or we have to be very clear about the repercussions of any reform on fiscal matters, labor matters, and other matters. If we only look at the systems, social protection systems, these solutions may seem to be too quick, but they are not necessarily the best. We could think maybe that the system, well, we have to increase contributions, and that would solve things. But this could lead us to increasing informality, increasing contributions, but lowering the level of, or the number of people that are contributing. So we start to leave others out. So that would be the first message. We must avoid, by all means, these reforms tend to be dealt with in the Treasury because they involve many resources. We have to avoid them being seen as only fiscal reforms. In many of the cases, this has been the situation, and this shapes the type of reform. We must look for a holistic vision, finding the parties that are involved. Second message, within the programs, when we start to look at health, pensions, etc., within the protection systems, we must make efforts in order to look at 4 angles. The report includes 3. I would include a 4th one. Coverage, of course. Adaptations, meaning the level that we have. Are we splendid or not? Like I said, sustainability is very important. We must guarantee that over time we are able to be there, not only today, but also tomorrow, and not to abandon our citizens who have no money. And the other one would be equality. It is a key topic in terms of social protection. Why is it so important to look at these 4 angles? I always imagine a square with 4 points: coverage, adaptation, sustainability, and equality. And when we consider a reform, we must have some sort of medical checkup and see how the pressure is doing, blood pressure is doing, and so forth. How is your coverage? Okay, your coverage is good. Adaptation, sustainability, and equality. And we must try to include the 4 points, not only sustainability, which oftentimes could be the focus, without obviously taking away the importance that it has. This is important because I think that it will be better in terms of welfare, and every time we use the term reform, people start to think some rights will be taken away from me, or it will have consequences on me. But I think that we will be improving the political economy if we look at this in a more holistic way. So we would assess a good reform, regardless of whether they are heading on the right path or not, being because of distribution, etc. These are all paths that will lead us to Rome, but we have to see how efficient we are at achieving these 4 things. That's the second thing. The third message I'd like to convey is that the way in which we fund this matters, and it matters very much. And I'll go back to things I have learned a lot from Santiago. We have been working for many years together. I have been very much contaminated with his good ideas. Basically, from the viewpoint of, from the fiscal side, I have to add this tax and add this other one. I get 1 point from here and another from there. From the viewpoint of productivity and of the labor market, it matters very much which one we're using and which one we're not using. It is very important to bear this in mind because let's assume, for instance, I'm going to mention 2 countries that maybe we could see as having very low contributions because they won't allow us to have very high benefits. Mexico is one of the countries. One would think that contributions or minimum contributions are necessary. But the fact that we need to increase contributions does not mean that we have to do this with we could think, for instance, of a contribution by the state of 5 points or a minimum pension, which at the end of the life will give you a pension equivalent to something universal that would be added up. Either we do it one or the other way. From the fiscal side, we have to look at the consequences in the economy. And I would argue that possibly the second option is better because it enables us to generate universal coverage to all the population. Otherwise, we don't guarantee it. And it also enables us to fund part of the system with income that come from different parts. From capital, they could come from added value. We spread out the basis to finance social protection, and I think that that is fundamental. And it is not absolutely clear, but evidence shows that if we lower based on work would lead us to more formality, and this would, of course, have very important repercussions in increasing the pensions coverage, etc., as well as adaptation. And this is specifically important for workers with low income that are now basically destroyed. Message number 4. In terms of pensions, it is key to achieve a systems integration. And I go back to people who are in unemployment. And I'm quoting Santiago. I heard him say this. I don't like to talk about a contributory or non-contributory pension. We call it contributory based on, well, on this and on other sources of income. I think that we have to build these different sides of the system very well, and this interaction is very important for us to reduce the burden that we place on work. I would argue that given the characteristics of the labor market in Latin America, be them comparable to the OECD, they could be too high given the characteristics of the market.
If we want to reduce this burden, if we want to make sure a basic pillar of a social pension that is not dependent from the tax sources, so we can handle it from a general tax perspective. And I don't know if I am within time, because otherwise I can speak much longer. Think of this idea. We have a minimum pillar financed through general taxes, or using the VAT or the income revenue tax, but it is a tax that does not come from labor. We can think that the contributory part, well, we can demand from the lowest part of the population those contributions, because this basic pillar would have the objective of generating a situation whereby the population would have coverage. If you think this for low-income people, well, if the pension gives me half the minimum wage, well, that is really helping me. And this second pillar is the one that is allowing this population to come to the service. Maybe they cannot pay, maybe their employers cannot finance everything. And this is not necessary, because in terms of pensions, everything is covered. So, just to tell you, the way we do things really matters. It doesn't have to be a tax perspective. It can be a holistic perspective. And the last message that I want to give you, and I think this is something that needs to be further developed. Pension systems are a source of inequality. I have not talked about health, but pensions promote inequality. There are two characteristics that promote this idea. Number one, for instance, the systems to pay the system. Now we are asking the whole of the population to pay the pensions of a few, the rich. That's not possible. The second characteristic that generates inequality is the one mentioned in the document. The contribution requirement, and the report includes very accurate information, and I would say this is really impressive. For instance, in Argentina, 50% of workers pay less than 1/4 of the system. This really shocked me. Even in Argentina, a mature system in terms of pensions, even in Argentina, many people do not have a pension. But who pays? Who gets a pension? We're talking about high-income workers. But who pays less? The low-income workers. So the low-income worker contributions, well, they pay for 25 years, but they are not going to receive anything in exchange, or very little. We are using this money to pay someone else's pension. So this is a system like Robin Hood. We are taking from the poor to pay the pensions of the rich. And I think this is something that we need to look at. And we have to make sure that the deficits are not, what can I say, are not socialized. And number two, we need to have distribution systems to make sure that those that have the least receive the more. The minimum requirement in terms of years has to be lower. Obviously, we're going to have adjustments, but this has to be done in a way that we don't create an obstacle for those who won't reach 20 or 30 years. Well, that's it. I'm sorry if it took me longer. I only want to say that problems of the region in this regard are very big, and they are very urgent. And I think that the region needs a better social protection system. So I want to congratulate CAF for giving us the tool in order to continue this discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you, Carmen. Thank you very much, Carmen, for your very accurate comments. And now we have Santiago Levy, non-resident senior fellow with the Global Economy and Development Program at Brookings Institution. He was a vice president of sectors at the IDB. Santiago has a BA in economics, and he has an MA in political economics, a PhD in economics from the University of Boston, and also from Cambridge University. Santiago, the floor is yours. Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to salute Luis Carranza and the Undersecretary. And I want to thank Pablo Sandiretti for inviting me to participate in this session. And I want to salute Carmen. She used to be IDB, just like me. We were colleagues for a number of years at the bank, so I really want to say hello to her. Congratulations, Luis, Pablo, Fernando, for this CAF report. I think it comes at the right time, and it is going to promote the debate that we have in the region. I want to say congratulations because in a report on Latin America, we normally find a big discussion about the appropriateness of the different systems. There is always a debate in the region. But this report is very clear. That's what I like it. This is a secondary issue. This discussion about the differences of the different systems, well, that's important, but it is a secondary element. I want to use my own words to express what the RED says. The regional systems failed, regardless of the type of system. We are facing a big failure of a public policy. We have pension systems with big problems. Carmen has already talked about some of them, lack of coverage, etc., etc. But the RED report pinpoints the problem: informality. Reforming the systems are not going to generate good systems. We have to think why we have informality and how we can reduce informality if we want to have successful pension systems. The CAF report has got very important information. Carmen talked about that she was shocked by the Argentinian information, but these contributions of workers, well, they only contribute a part of their time to the pension system, and this is something very important. It is very difficult to get this information. Unfortunately, the report only includes 4 countries, but it'd be great to have this information for more countries. Apart from showing that the contribution average is very low, it also shows that the contribution densities are not homogeneous. There is only a small group of workers, 20, 25 or 30% of the workforce that actually contribute at a rate of 65%. The other workers have a lower contribution density. The RED does not show this because they are not including this information, but we can say that the high density contribution workers work in high salary companies and the low density workers work in low salary companies, and this is what Carmen was mentioning before. Allow me to talk about an additional implication derived from the RED report, and hopefully this will change the technology and the language that we use in order to talk about public policies in Latin America. We have been using the wrong language for decades. We talk about formal and informal workers. Let's think of a worker that is right in the middle with a contribution of 50%. Throughout his work life, he was a formal 50%, and the rest he was not formal. How can we name a worker that has spent 50% of his time in formality and 50% in the formal market? Because we always think that the informal workers are always the same. The RED report shows that this is not the case. The same people with the same skills sometimes have an informal job and sometimes have a formal job. So let's stop talking about informal and formal works. So we have to think about the timing when people are formal and when people are informal. This is not only about changing semantics. semantics. If we use this language, we are going to ask ourselves, why does the same person with the same human capital and the same skills sometimes have a formal job and sometimes he does not have a formal job? In this way, we can get away from discussions about informality because it is the same person in two different situations. Carmen has already talked about some of the implications of pension systems. The RED has a specific characteristic. It does not only talk about pensions and health. Carmen mentioned the inequality of systems. In many countries of the region, pension and health systems are related. Let me show you how. There are minimum requirements in terms of the weeks that you need to work in order to get access to a pension. 24 years in Mexico, in Bolivia 25 years. Every country has got different minimum requirements in order to have access to a pension. But those minimum requirements are also applicable for the health sector. Many systems say that workers that participate in contributory systems can only have access to the contributory system once they retire if they have a pension. If the contribution density is not enough, workers are left without health care, and this is inequality because those paying towards the health system, this money is also used for pensions, but there are many active workers that are paying for pension and health care systems, and once they reach the retirement, they will not have access to medical services. We are talking about those with the lowest contribution densities. We are talking about workers in small companies with low salaries. So Carmen was talking about the Robin Hood. It is not only the pension Robin Hood, it is also a health care Robin Hood. And this is happening in some countries. And this is an inequality that has not been studied. The RED highlights non-contributory pensions, and Fernando mentioned this. These pensions should be universal, or not? According to the report, this would represent 75% or 75% of the GDP. Fernando, I think these pensions are urgent because of the following reasons. Even if tomorrow we would fix the informality problem, it would not be enough time for those people who are 40 or 50. They will not be able to reach a contributory pension. We're not starting from scratch. We have many people that have been in the labor market for many years. So I want to highlight this conclusion. The non-contributory pensions need to be individual, and this has to be urgent. We need to acknowledge that for many generations, those who are 50 or 55, even though we were able to fix the informality problem, this will be too late for them. Fernando talked about this when he talked about sources of financing, and this was mentioned by Carmen as well. We do not acknowledge that there is an exchange of financing sources. Carmen mentioned this, but I want to elaborate. There is a relationship between the density of contribution and the contribution rate. The higher the contribution rate, the higher the tax for informality. Remember that we are forcing people to save. We are forcing them to do something that they wouldn't do if they were not forced to do. So we are imposing a cost on them because it is part of the law. So the cost is higher because we have a higher rate. And the contribution densities are going to be lower. If we think about the financing sources, if we say that higher contribution rates will result in financing sources, we're making a mistake because we are lowering the density. We are going to have higher rates in the case of workers with densities of 80%. Who's going to be left out of the system? Well, the rest. 2/3 of the workers. Getting financing from different rates or different sources is going to increase the inclusiveness. Informality is not only a piece of information. Informality is within the contribution system that we are creating for pensions and health. The RED report includes very well information showing that the region is not doing very well in this regard. We have the non-contributory pensions. I have some doubts about the financing of contributory pensions by means of high rates. If we were able to increase the contribution densities, the gain would be greater. This could imply a greater level of formality or a longer time in formality. And this implies more time in companies where I can be trained, more time in companies where they are willing to invest in me, companies with a higher productivity. I am going to repeat what Carmen said. We need to have a holistic perspective of the social security system, and this is what the CAF is doing, because they put everything on at the same level. In the following RED, we would need to take this discussion about pensions and healthcare, including the tax arena. We cannot solve pension problems if we don't have a fiscal or a tax reform. A tax reform in order to solve these problems, in order to displace financing to other sources of tax, more progressive sources that will increase the coverage. And my last comment. We are going to record all the RED results. We have had a decrease of the different rates. Depending on the assessment, we can have hysterices and a permanent shock in the contributions system. Before COVID, the RED was very urgent. We need to rethink everything. After COVID, if we don't think this, would be irresponsible. So congratulations to CAF, and it was a pleasure to participate with Carmen and Fernando, and thank you to the organizers. Thank you, Santiago and Carmen. I want to remind you that you can give us your opinion using hashtag REDCAF, and you can follow us at Agenda CAF on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Latin America is a relatively young region, but this won't be the case for a long time. 1 in every 12 Latin Americans is 65 or older. In Europe, this relationship is 1 to 5. By 2050, however, the UN indicates that Latin America will reach the values that Europe has nowadays. By the end of the century, 1/3 of the Latin American population will be more than 65 years old. Now Pablo Sanguinetti, Vice President of Knowledge of CAF, will moderate the session Recent and Future Pension and Health Reforms in the Region. Pablo, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah. Welcome. Thank you very much for your participation. It is great to have you here. I am going to introduce the members of the panel. We have listened to very interesting comments with Mr. Carranza, with Mr. Giorgio, the presentation of the report by Fernando, and many good comments by Santiago and Carmen. And now we are going to have a panel with those that have done the dirty work in the development of reforms. They are the ones that lead this movement of pensions and health. So we are very happy to have these officials with us. The idea of the panel is to ask some questions, 3 questions actually, and then we are going to finish with some closing remarks. You will have from 4 to 5 minutes in order to give an answer, in order to have a lively exchange of ideas. So let me introduce the members of the panel. We have Azucena Arbeleche, Minister of Economy and Finance of Uruguay. She is an economist with an MA from the University of Chile. And before, she was also part of the University of Montevideo. Alberto Arenas de Mesa, PhD in economics from Pittsburgh University. He is the former Minister of Finance of Chile, and he led the reforms in 2008, and he participated in the consultative meeting of ministers. We have Roman Macaya Hayes from Costa Rica. She has an MA in healthcare systems, a PhD from the UCLA University. He has worked as an entrepreneur in the field of agriculture and health. And finally, we have Carlos Noriega from Mexico. He's an economist from ITAM. He has an MA from Rochester University. He has participated in public affairs quite lengthy. He was Undersecretary of Planning and coordinator and advisor to the minister. He developed the reforms on social security, specifically pension and healthcare. In the private sector, he participated in finances. And as you can see, we have specialists, experts in the field. And I am sure the panel is going to be very lively. I am going to start with one question, and this question is about the areas of intervention that you have had in terms of the reforms. And then I am going to continue with the 2 general questions. So we're going to start with Azucena and the Uruguay perspective. Does Uruguay, have you thought about creating a committee of experts from different parties and social organizations? Azucena, what are the main objectives of the reform in Uruguay? We know that Uruguay is a country where the aging process is quite significant in comparison to the region. So I am sure this is a source of concern for your country. So Azucena, good afternoon. I want to thank you for allowing me to participate in this panel. And thank you for allowing me to participate in the presentation of the RED. I want to thank the CAF. They reacted right after the identification of COVID cases in Latin America, and they have helped different countries in the implementation of policies for facing these crises. As Pablo was mentioning, well, in Uruguay, in comparison to other countries, we have a good situation when it comes to the social security system. We have been working on this system for many years, but we understand that we need to modify it in order to continue with the system. And when I say modify, well, we try to analyze or concentrate on 3 different areas for a new social security system. The coverage of the system, and we understand that the Uruguayan position is very good. Then the appropriateness of the benefits, what the system gives. We need to improve in this regard. And lastly, something that has been mentioned by my colleagues, the sustainability of the system. And in this case, we need to revise the system in Uruguay so it can be sustainable into the future. The new administration, the new government in Uruguay, well, we had been working for many years on this diagnosis. We knew that we had to do something. In Uruguay, after the first COVID cases, we created an experts commission so they could develop the reform of the system. In July, it went through Parliament, and a commission of 15 experts was created. It covers all the political system. We have experts from the government and experts from the opposition. We have experts representing workers, pensioners, the different industrial chambers. So it was necessary to have this type of participation with all the stakeholders in order to negotiate and in order to reach a proposal in this highly sensitive topic. We talked about specific cases. Today is Tuesday. On Thursday, we're going to start with the formal works of the Commission. As of Thursday, they will have 90 days for the diagnosis and then 90 days for presenting concrete proposals.
Uruguay, beyond the good characteristics compared to the region, has been increasing the percentage of persons above age 65. At this time, the CAF report states that 15% of the population in Uruguay is above this age, and that is more than the 8% in the rest of Latin America, and more and closer to European levels. It is important to welcome the increase on life expectancy to see how we can provide this support to the elderly. What are the elements that we have to consider when we design a new system for Social Security? The main elements, and this is something that related to justice and the approach that was given to this, and the world will not be over in 4 years. We have to look forward. Another important element in this reform is the fact that it is not all of the state or all of the private sector that has to provide solutions. And this is why it is important for solutions to be shared, that responsibilities are shared and that there are incentives. the principle of solidarity is basic in order to reach this minimum coverage and basic coverage that is related to the requirements so that the population is fine. And the last element, but not least important, is related to the reliability in the long term. We could have an excellent design, great coverage, important benefits now, but if this is not sustainable over time, then it is useless. I think that this is the most important part, and thus I believe that it is essential to have a comprehensive view in Uruguay of the social security system with characteristics that we will be debating afterwards in the panel. But I believe that this is something that will be helping us. It will give us the possibility, first of all, to give support to the elderly, and second, it will allow us to reconsider this. This is a very important pillar that will provide us with the necessary things for our system. Thank you very much, Azucena. Now we have Chile and we have Alberto. I'd like to ask you, you were a very important stakeholder in the pension reform in 2008 in Chile. Let's recall that Chile was one of the first countries that established the reform to these systems. I'd like to listen to your opinion. How do you evaluate this reform, and what are your current considerations with regards to the case of Chile? 4 minutes. Well, thank you very much, and good morning. I don't know where we are. Is it Mexico City? Well, good afternoon in Chile, in Santiago de Chile. And my greetings to all of the panelists. I'd like to thank CAF for the invitation to take part in this policy panel within the framework of the Red Report. I got the chance to read it, and it is very good. Besides, it is devoted to the pension and health topic in Latin America, very significant. And this is one of the questions with regards to the evaluation of the reform. I did have a special control in that sense, and we established 4 very quick things. We decided to create this solidarity or this defined benefit contributions. Most people were poor, and now only 1% is poor with regards to these people. Coverage, we have vulnerable groups. This defined benefit, 50% of the people are covered by this defined benefit system. The replacement rate, this is something that is still pending. And finally, financial sustainability. There was a design in the pension reform in order to give financial sustainability to the basic reform. The second part, of which are the main challenges of the Chilean pension system, I would say that not only in Chile, but also in the region, the main challenge of the pension system is sustainability. And I'd like to stop here because sustainability is different from financial sustainability. Sustainability is a comprehensive view that is related to coverage, the right coverage, and sufficiency in terms of expectations and financial sustainability as well. In this equation, I would say that Chile does not face important problems given the financial sustainability today, but it does have a sufficiency of these contributions. But speaking in Spanish, well, the level of pensions, the replacement rate is low. This is about, you place it in your report, about 30 to 35%. It does not meet the expectations to 40 years in capitalization funds. It is not meeting expectations. And among other topics, I'd like to say that this is basically what has happened in the last few years. Since 2017, a reform was passed, a second bill was submitted, then a third bill later on. And there are 2 characteristics. It is a more structural reform to the pension reform, to the pension system in Chile, because it is increasing the rates at 16% by generating collective savings And there is a big debate in terms of how much has to be capitalization and how much should be retirement savings, etc. But basically, in my opinion, and I will close precisely in the 4 minutes, after 40 years of capitalizations of these in Chile, Chile made the decision, and this is very important because this is cross-sectional. Let's say we like one soccer team, but it is cross-sectional. And I'd like to greet the Madam Minister of Uruguay. You started in Latin America, then came Panama, Costa Rica, etc. So this system includes international solidarity, a greater participation of the public sector, both in terms of the administration and funding. And this is currently the main debate in Chilean society, highly motivated by the unsustainability of the system with low pensions. And these low pensions basically generate the need to make a reform to it. Thank you very much, Alberto. Very interesting what you have said. Chile began with a very specific system, with a reform, and now it sees, well, a mixed system. Some countries already have it. Very, very interesting. Now we move to Costa Rica, to Roman. The question I have for Roman is, based on your criteria, what are the main challenges of the pension system in Costa Rica? What actions should be undertaken in order to face those challenges? In terms of health, and maybe you would also like to talk about the health system in Costa Rica and the challenges that it is facing concerning population evolution, etc. Thank you very much, Paulo, and my special greetings to all of my colleagues and my female colleague in this panel. I am honored to be here today. Definitely, the aging of the population is the most important challenge for the pension system, but also for the health system. Now that you talked about health, I'll give you a piece of information that draws our attention very much. If one analyzes the use of hospitalization days per capita by age group, persons over 65 years of age in our health system use 13.5 times more days of hospitalization than the group between 20 and 40 years of age. And as this pyramid moves towards the age of 65, the increase in demand of health services is exponential. It is huge. The challenge is dual in our social security system that provides both health systems as well as pension systems. This is a big challenge. To give you some statistics, in 1950, the population under 14 years of age was 42% of the population, and only 3% were people over 65 years old. And in 2050, people under 14 will be 6%, and people over 65 will be 21%. The trend is very strong towards aging, and what counts in terms of pensions and also in terms of health is what is the life expectancy after 65 years old. Our system, our social security, is created in 1941, but the pension system comes into force in 47. I'll give you some information that date back to 1940. In 1940, life expectancy after 65 years of age was 11.34 years for men and 11.75 years for women. The difference was very small between men and women back then. Nowadays, it is 18.8% for men and 21.34 for women. So this is life expectancy after the age of 65. There is not only a trend to aging and to having more people in this age group, but also a life expectancy that is much longer. Now, with regards to our health system, the minimum pension age was of 65 years from the origin, based on these numbers. And in the following decades, we have been lowering the minimum ages for retirement. In 71, it went down to 60, in 80 to 57, and in 84, we even decreased it for women to 55. In 1991, we started to increase once again. The normal age is always 65 years of age, but there are possibilities to advance it based on different conditions. It is not how many fees have been contributed to the system, but this is something that has no logics. Thinking that in 1947, when it came into force, when the system came into force, there was no way to advance this pension to the age of 65. And only to close, informality. Informality is also a very important topic. It averages 42.5%. We are a population that has high levels of informality in micro companies, persons that are working part-time, freelance workers, and technology platforms, which will be the next question, are very, very much present in Costa Rica. We have the highest use of Uber in Latin America. We are a highly Uberized population, if we want to use the term, and all of the different similar platforms are widely used. And this generates a big challenge of how to give sustainability to the system. And we will be talking about in the next question. Thank you. Thank you so much, Roman. Very interesting what you said. The system started in the 40s to 65, and then it started to go down. Just the opposite, and then it started to go up. In the report, we say that there is a margin of action in order to increase this marginally. And it's also an important characteristic in some cases. We will now listen to Carlos Noriega. I did not formally introduce you all. Carlos heads the insurance and pensions and Social Security at the Ministry of Finance in Mexico. In Mexico, the government very recently launched a reform to its pension system. Some things, I think, that are being proposed by the country are mentioned in the report. I just wanted to ask you, what are the purposes of this reform, and what are the main measures that will be adopted? Please, Carlos. Thank you very much. I'd like to begin by thanking you for the invitation to be here. I am honored to take part with all of you in this panel. Thank you for your report. After over 20 years of having an individual capitalization system, we have been including new areas and facing new challenges. What was just mentioned, the informality and financial issues, and what Roman mentioned earlier is very important. When we talk about the elderly, but not only of the elderly, but they are beyond elderly. And the administration established a universal pension. This means for everyone, regardless of whether they have access or not to Social Security, or regardless of whether they have or not a pension. For all citizens over 68 years of age, with the exception of some groups in extreme poverty or of indigenous origin, which begins at age 65. When this program started, it started at 68, and there was no debate, there was no discussion, as has occurred in other countries. 68 years of age were considered without further debate. This program was also taken to the constitutional level. Based on the Constitution, we have the right to that pension. There is no doubt concerning the financial feasibility long term. Mexico is characterized by having a very low rate of contributions, of fiscal contributions. Tax collections are very low, And this universal pension is also low. But we now have a hybrid system with a non-contributory pension, universal pension, and a contributory pension. In the contributory pension, the reform that was just submitted to Congress attempts to, first of all, recognizing the informality to lower the number of years in order to have a right. Santiago Levy mentioned a while ago that there are some generations that were already too late in order to include them. In order to include somehow those generations, it has gone down from 25 to 15 years, the minimum age in order to have the right for a pension. And this will start to go up gradually in order to reach 20 years. In summary, we went from 25 to 20 years in terms of the right to have this pension. Second, in Mexico, we have a pension that is guaranteed by the state, meaning that if a person complies with a retirement age and the number of years of contribution, but their savings are not enough in order to reach the minimum, then the government will contribute the difference. So this significantly increases the guaranteed pension in such a way that we are able to, with a lower contribution, we have a better guaranteed pension at a replacement rate that should be for the first 60-70% of workers. This rate would be close to 50-60%. We have increased the replacement rate. Importantly, we have also increased the possibility to have a right to a pension, and we increased the pension. This is done by increasing contributions as well. And the fact that contributions are increased will be in charge of the employer. However, the contributions made by the government, which are now also for all of the workers, will be divided by or concentrating on the poorest workers in such a way that the lowest income workers, which are also the smallest companies' employees, and they will not have any increase in that burden, precisely in order to avoid incentives to informality, so that larger companies are those that generally have workers with higher income, and they will be bearing the burden. We are trying to target each one of these topics marginally because this is not a new reform. This is a reform that is increased and that deepens in what we had. What Roman mentioned is very important. Those few workers that reach with their savings a pension above the lowest one get a life rent, which is close to 25 years of work in what we call afores. This is the process of accumulation, and we are at the time where the system is maturing, and we are now seeing a new stage, and we are facing here an important situation. Chile has already seen this several years ago. If we can reduce this life rent in a limited rate at around 80 to 82 years, and then a longevity insurance in charge of the federal government. This way, we are guaranteeing the feasibility of income, but we are also avoiding this conflict of interest of giving sustainability to an insurance company and at the same time not to place a burden on life rents based on the pension that our workers get. So we are talking about this fourth age or age group or this fourth stage in life of workers. And this is a complex reform that has different angles, but one of the main difficulties that we find in reforms is consensus between the three parties: worker, employer, state. And in this case, the employer sector has the idea that we will absorb the increase. Contribution will go up from 6.5% to 15% within a period of 10 years. The first 2 years are a period of grace, considering the pandemic, and it has been increasing gradually for 8 years. So the adjustments that they have to make are made so that they can program their training, inclusion, so that they will not be breaking down a balance. This is, in essence, the reform that we are preparing. Thank you very much, Carlos. We are listening to very interesting things. Capitalization systems, interesting. It is interesting to see what is happening in Mexico as well. Now we have a second part of thoughts, more general thoughts, and this touches upon one of the items in the report. The common question to all, please make your comments shorter, and this is linked to how labor markets are conditioning the functioning of systems, pension systems. Roman already mentioned, and also in previous comments in the report, informality. How this makes it difficult to have coverage and to consider contributory systems. This is very relevant within the current context of technology changes. We mentioned in the report that platform work and also the pandemic. One in the future can give a big strike on our IT systems. I'd like to ask you, how should social security systems be adapted, contributory systems, to the context of high levels of informality, IT changes, pandemic? What is the role, or what is still the role of health pension systems, non-contributory? I'll begin by Roman. Please, Roman, 3 minutes. What I briefly touched upon, which was IT platforms, is very present in the Costa Rican economy. All the persons, if they are not considered to be independent workers, they are doomed to a pension under the non-contributory system. This is a relatively low pension. We are talking about 82,000 colones, close to $130 a month. And this is a big challenge. It is an important and growing trend. If we have a higher penetration in these services, then there will be a different number of references, drivers, people delivering food at homes, etc. And informality in general has been structural, above 40% during the last 10 years. And this is something that we are trying to deal with. A topic that we are trying to reform is to have schemes in order to provide insurance and that they should be more flexible, guaranteeing worked hours in some areas. For instance, we have created for domestic workers a special type of insurance. For coffee harvesters, there is a special insurance. For small and micro companies, we also have a special insurance. But they have to be born in formality. There is no amnesty. So an SME that has been in informality for 10 years cannot have access to a benefit which is basically of 4 years of an insurance of a percentage that is much lower, that is adjusted, and then in the 5th year it is harmonized based on the total industrial sector. Other schemes that are being considered, there is a bill in Congress which is called consumption pension. We are not all formal in the economy, but we all consume. The idea is that a small percentage to begin with of the VAT will go to an individual account, and it will be capitalized individually. But after a certain number of minimum wages, it will become a defined benefit insurance, so that there is compensation between the different consumption capability or capacities. And it will be at the level, it would be 50% would be individual capitalization, and the remaining 50% would be a pool of a defined benefit pension. But this is the big challenge. We basically have to be evolving to revenue or income for pensions that are not so much dependent upon the number of people that are working, because that trend in the long run is deficient, more so based on the levels of informality that we have. This is the big challenge we face. Thank you very much, Roman. Now, Azucena from Uruguay, in terms of informality. I think that it is probably not the biggest issue, but technology is also expanding in the country, among the private sector, a certain audience. So this is a relevant topic for you as well. How have you considered it? Now, can you hear me? Yes. I was saying that both topics are important for us, both the IT changes that we are facing as well as informality. Our numbers are slightly lower than in the Uruguay report. It reads 30% of workers are in informality. We have that it is 25%. In any case, it is under the average of 60-some% for Latin America. We believe that this is a challenge that we have ahead of us, and that it's not black and white, formal, informal. And with regards to work and to work through the platform, it is an important challenge, but it can also be a very good opportunity. All of these IT changes in the long term would involve more growth, more jobs, wages. But what is important is how to go and to move forward in the short term so that the characteristics and job supply are accompanied by the demand characteristics. I think that these challenges around or in a pandemic or in a scenario like the one we are experiencing in a pandemic is good because it compels us to rethink or think more in depth on these topics. The changes that would be occurring would be accelerated by the pandemic, and since Uruguay is undergoing a reform process of its social security system, well, this will help us rethink some of the topics, such as including all of these new work modes. This is normal now, and similar to what other countries were saying, it is the same for us. There are new ways of working that have to be included in the new reform.
Informalidad.
And when it comes to informality, we have to stop thinking about the traditional scheme. We need to make sure that these people come back to the formal market, understanding the complexities that were mentioned previously. And we have to acknowledge that those that participate in the formal market, well, something can happen like a pandemic, and the activity is going to go down and there is no coverage, and we need to think of this. I think the pandemic has really helped us to think about a changing situation, but this is the right time in order to actually understand that we need to work in a different way because we have a new normality. The social security coverage, including unemployment and pension funds, well, we have to include these new characteristics when designing these programs. Now I go to Alberto in Santiago. You have improved informality in the case of Chile. You have one of the lowest informality rates. But as Azucena was mentioning, we have some informal workers. And these informal workers need to make contributions. I don't understand what the situation is in Chile. And what about the platform workers? Most of the times they are freelancers. And this is mentioned in the report. Compared to other freelancers, the platform workers have a better control by means of the digital platform. We can control the contributions that they make. So what do you think of this in the case of Chile? Does this have an impact on the pension system? As Azucena was mentioning, When we compare different countries, Chile has a lower level of informality, but the pandemic is going to change these numbers. This is really impacting every single country. Let's see what happens in the near future. But Pablo, I liked something about the document, specifically in terms of informality. You talk about informality, you talk about technological change and the aging process. But we also have to take into consideration the gender and also the economic uncertainty. This generates a scenario that is going to bring about a big demand of protection systems with a universal character, like never before. So in this sense, the classical contributory systems will face problems in order to overcome this scenario. The contributory systems do not integrate freelancers. In the case of Chile, we are talking about 60% in the case of workers and only 5% for freelancers. So there is a big gap. Contributory systems are limited because of the characteristics of the labor market. Let me give you some information that confirms this situation. In Latin America, during this century, the coverage passed or increased 25%. The non-contributory system, well, 20% out of those 25 are explained by the non-contributory systems in the region. 80% of the coverage increase in the region come from non-contributory systems. Because before the 80s, only 6 countries had a contributory system. Look what Mexico is doing. They have a universal orientation, just like Bolivia. So we have been promoting these systems in the region. So I think there is a very important debate when it comes to the informality and the way different countries have faced this informality. We have to identify the big challenge. The big challenge is to make sure that we have a minimum coverage. But the second challenge, and we have to mention this, is the how painful the benefit is, because we need to have a benefit that goes beyond the poverty line. At CEPADE, we did this calculation. You did the same in order to define the universality. If low-income workers, if the poor population, well, if we had a poverty line, if we had a contribution system that would cost us 0.3, 0.6 of the GDP, that's for 2030. So basically, there is a flexibility in the region in order to face informality by means of non-contributory pension systems, in order to tackle the poverty in the region. Because this is going to be an issue now in the region, especially from the perspective of the systems. Thank you, Alberto. And now, Carlos. You have been talking about the situation in Mexico, and this was mentioned by Santiago as well. It is about getting away from the financing of the contributory financing of the pension system. Because we need both individual and the employer's contribution in order to have more general contributions. What do you think of the situation in Mexico? How are you going to work this in Mexico? How are you going to fight informality in Mexico? Well, after the theory, I am going to give you a practical perspective, and we always have a dilemma. Every country has got a different history in terms of evolution. Santiago emphasizes something. We needed to change the contribution system or the collection system. In Mexico, the income revenue tax, well, not many people in Mexico pay this tax because they don't have a high enough salary. So there is an informal sector. It is not informal, but they don't pay this tax. And there is another thing that Santiago didn't mention, but we needed to mention it, the situation of the labor market as such. It seems that we are talking about contributions that can promote informality. So we have to take into consideration the regulations of the labor market, because these regulations are an obstacle of informality, because when employers need to pay the social security, training services, etc., well, that also increases the cost of the labor market. So after the pandemic, we need to incorporate these topics into the discussion. In some cases, it is not easy to change the trend in the labor market, the trend of the collection system and the different taxes that we have, and the different exceptions that we have in Mexico for medicines and food. We have medicines that are exempt of the VAT, the value-added tax. So we are talking about a global situation. The society can live using all the labor schemes with a longer longevity. So the question is, are the steps that we are taking leading us to a new economic and social paradigm, or are these changes or these steps driving us away? Obviously, we need to continue with the dialogue. We need to continue reflecting on the participation of the state and the participation of employers. We have freelancers and we are our own employers, so that's something that we need to take into consideration. The challenge that we are facing is much bigger. With this pandemic, we are opening our eyes to a world that we didn't want to see. The pension system in Mexico has an electronic platform which is quite advanced, and it gives a high level of confidence to workers. It is true, the pandemic allows us to progress in this regard, but this has not been linked to the collection system in Mexico. In Mexico, we have a tax collection system, and we need to define a salary in order to define the taxes, including social security. So we need to do many things in the future. So are the changes that we are introducing in order to improve our area of responsibility, are these steps taking us to a better or worse scenario? Northern countries have very good universal social security systems, and they had to look back because incentives were being reduced. So I think we really needed to analyze deeper. As Alberto was mentioning, it is not only about the financial sustainability, but also the social recognition. And with this, I am going to finish. I think that the pension culture is a culture that is difficult to implement. It is difficult to be part of this culture. The last reforms in Sweden changed the situation. It is not about having experts in pension systems in workers. We need to have a regulation that actually matches the culture of the population, and this is the responsibility of the state. The state needs to create this system, a system that is not so complicated, because we don't need financial experts in order to understand these systems. We have 3 minutes. But I have one last question, but I think this is the most difficult one, but I'm going to give you 30 seconds. This is about the implementation of these reforms, the pension reforms, because these reforms have got political implications in the long run. So the question is, how can we implement this reform? How can we have a consensus so as to have an orderly implementation? Introducing adjustments throughout time. What is the participation of the state when it comes to the implementation of the reforms? So I'm going to start with Azucena. You will have 1 minute. One minute. Uruguay is starting a reform of the social security system. We are convinced that this is going to be successful in every single way. And you were asking, we need to have a dialogue with all the stakeholders. That's why we have this group of experts with representatives from political parties and from different sectors of the population. Yeah, you're back. I'm sorry. And we know about the relevance of these reforms. Many of those older than 65, they have coverage, but the coverage has to be good quality and it has to be sustainable. It is important to have expectations. It is important to know that the system will be there when people retire. In Costa Rica, we are socializing the proposals. The proposals have been measured in terms of their impact. For instance, eliminating the window for the early pension that gives us 16 additional years for the pension system. And this is using information from 1947. So it is difficult to argue against this, but we need to be transparent and we need to measure the impact of each of the proposals, because many of the proposals can have a big impact. And the idea is to have a seamless process with the highest benefit. Alberto, 1 minute. I would say that the reform of these systems only take place once every 3 decades. So we need to have a horizontal agreements. Obviously, we are on the other side. Now we have to think about politics. I have 2 general ideas. We need to have technical agreements in order to have political agreements, and the technical agreements can be reached using databases in order to have the necessary coverage, the replacement rates. And the second comment, because I only have 10 seconds, I am going to say, if you are implementing a reform, you need to take a step forward in terms of institutional strengthening. I would say that the quality of institutions defines the conditions of the pensions policies. If we need to introduce changes, we need to think about the institutions. So we have to take a step forward in order to think about the institutions, regardless of the reform that you want to implement. Carlos, I would add only one thing. The difference between the legal and economical definitions. Who makes the contributions and how much? Well, the law can say something and economics can say something else. That is to say, the impact of payments is not necessarily in the hands of the party defined by the law. This definition can really make a difference. In the case of Mexico, the trigger was the acknowledgement by employers, acknowledging that they could break this freezing state or frozen state, and they decided to take on the responsibility of the increase, and they requested a long period in order to do this. But no one really knows who's going to pay. But this unlocked a very long discussion, and this helped us to take a step forward. As Alberto says, this only takes place once every 30 years. It would be good to have revision sessions in order to assess the systems. And this is something that we are introducing. We need to check the parameters every now and then. But we need to identify the three sectors, the impact that we're going to have in the long run in the three sectors. This is really going to help us trigger the discussion. Thank you. So I am taking 3 lessons from you. Apart from the technical details necessary to achieve this, in order to have reforms, we need to have good data, we need to have good calculations, we need to be transparent, and as Azucena said, we need to have transversal agreements. And what you said, Carlos, duality. Because these are things that change over time. We have demographic challenges that change over time. It is not possible to do things overnight. So your recommendations have been very helpful. It is all up to you. You are the policy makers, and I think this event has been very interesting. I want to thank all the participants, Santiago, Mr. Carranza, and the members of the panel, and all the audience that was with us. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you, Pablo, Azucena, Carlos, Roman. Thank you for this excellent panel. On behalf of CAV, Development Bank of Latin America, we want to thank all those who were with us during the presentation of the RED 2020. This event is already available on www.caf.com. Thank you very much.